some big issues with this audience. I'm mindful there's a huge range of expertise kind of online, and it would be really great to draw on that over the next hour or an hour and a half. So I will try and limit my remarks to as few as possible while endeavoring to set the scene. I'm going to be covering material that many of you will be familiar with. So please bear with me. I will go through the slides, of which there's quite a lot, rather fast. But Jack can make them available to you, and you can look at them at your leisure over the coming days and weeks if you wish. So what I plan to do, if the system will work for me, is to say a few words about 4 topics. Why governing well is important, why it's difficult, how well are we doing, and how might we improve what we're doing. And this is all in the context of thinking about the concept of anticipatory governance. How do we govern well for the long run, not least by anticipating the kinds of problems we're going to face, and design our systems, structures, institutions, and so on in ways that will help us cope with what is coming at us from the future. So let me start with the topic of why governing for the future matters. And I'm going to be quite brief about this because I think everyone listening in will be well aware why it matters. There's a vast literature on these sorts of topics, and many of you will be familiar with that literature, and you can dabble into it. Some of the references I've got there. Can I just draw your attention to a book that was published last year by Dr. Jane Davidson, who I got to know in the United Kingdom about 2 years ago. Jane was the Minister for well, the Environment in the Welsh government during the earlier part of the century, and is largely responsible for the legislation that was enacted by the Welsh Parliament in 2015 called the well, it's a legislation about protecting future generations.
Yeah, it's the Future Generations
Act, correct. Yeah. Wales Act, that's right. And Jane has written a book called Future Gen, Lessons from a Small Country, which basically outlines the background to that legislation, what it says, and an initial reflection on how well it's working. And there's a lot of material online in relation to this legislation, including obviously from the Office of the Commissioner for Future Generations in Cardiff, which you can look at. But I'm not going to be speaking specifically about Wales, but it is a really interesting piece of legislation that I think has some important lessons for New Zealand and elsewhere. A couple of quotes that some of you will be familiar with. A society grows great when old men and women plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. People looking forward and not just seeking to protect their own interests, but to do things that will benefit future generations. And then from the great law of the Iroquois Confederacy, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. We obviously face some serious problems. There are various ways of framing the kind of problems we have, particularly in the policy sense. And I've listed some of the different ways in which we can frame the challenges we face at the moment. But they include the whole question of, how best to protect future interests and the long-term common good, how to ensure sustainability, wise stewardship, how to ensure that we can sort of bring the long run into short-term political focus. I was talking to the Governance and Administration Committee of Parliament this morning with a colleague about that whole question. How do we get Parliament and how do we get the government to give more attention to the long run? How do we incentivize democratic policymakers to give adequate weight to long run risks and vulnerabilities, and particularly to creeping problems or slow burner problems, and I'll mention those in a moment. And then the last one there, how do we enhance the quality of anticipatory governance? Why is governing for the long run really important? Well, very simply, because if we don't govern well, we're going to govern badly. And unfortunately, human beings have the capacity now, as a result of enormous technological advances over the last couple of centuries, to do enormous damage, if not, in fact, destroy much of the life on this planet and to make our current civilization terminal. And unfortunately, we seem to be proceeding to do that. We are creating ecological havoc, and the damage that will be reaped on future generations will be very great. So you know, it seems to me there's a very powerful moral duty to seek to protect future generations and indeed our future selves, and to exercise what various people refer to either as good stewardship or trusteeship or guardianship, not only on behalf of human beings, but obviously on behalf of the whole biosphere. Let me see if I can get this to go. Yes, obviously, as everyone knows, online we face a formidable range of very difficult governance challenges. We're in the midst still globally of a pandemic, and there will be more pandemics over the coming decades, almost certainly. But we obviously face huge ecological challenges, ongoing natural disasters of various kinds. We face large-scale involuntary migration, which is only going to get worse as climate change impacts more severely across the world. We face the problem of critical infrastructure being vulnerable, indeed vulnerable to cyber attacks, as we're just witnessing right now in the United States. We have significant challenges in many parts of the world with high and rising levels of public debt, even though, of course, at the moment we have low interest rates. That won't necessarily remain the case. We have the ebbing of the population, of the human tide, in the sense that population growth rates are slowing down in most countries around the world, which is a good thing. On the other hand, we're faced with significant population aging, which also poses you know, some significant challenges, and so on and so on. So lots of big challenges. How should we sort of face those challenges from the point of view of principles for good governance? Huge literature in that space. I'm going to just pass over much of this in just a few seconds, just to draw your attention to the World Commission on Environment and Development, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and the very important principle that commission enunciated, namely that the needs that we should seek to ensure that we meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And whether we focus in on needs or rights or possibly well-being, the fundamental point is that we need to ensure a safe prospect for all future generations, you know, for thousands, if not millions of years to come. And we're not doing that very well. Edith Brown Wise, who some of you may be familiar with, a very distinguished American legal scholar who I had the pleasure of meeting in Washington, D.C. about 7 years ago. She wrote a book back in about 1989, which has had a significant impact. And she argued that we should seek, that each generation of humanity should leave the planet, quote, in no worse condition than it received it, and provide equitable access to its resources and benefits. Well, I don't think that's enough, not particularly for generations like ours who have done very considerable damage. I think we should be seeking improvement, repair, restoration, and so on, though I appreciate that's very challenging. Now, just a few words on the concept of anticipatory governance. It's a relatively new concept in the overall scheme of things. After all, people have been writing about governance for thousands of years. In the Western tradition, certainly since Plato and Aristotle, but they didn't talk about anticipatory governance. The concept of anticipatory governance, to my knowledge, was first used actually in the Canadian master's thesis. So there you are, Jack, a Canadian, back in 1993, 30 years ago. But the student was referring to anticipatory and yes, anticipatory governance. And really since then, and since the work of a number of people working particularly in the areas of sustainability, climate change, and so on, the concept has become more widely used. But as it stands currently, as far as I'm aware, I think we've got some background noise here.
And everyone, please ensure that they have their mic on mute. Yeah, can everyone please put their mic on mute, except Jonathan, of course.
You need to get on it. Close it down.
Okay, are we all right now? Okay, but key point, there's no widely agreed definition and no widely agreed set of attributes for anticipatory governance. But there are definitions, and there's a couple here we can come back to discuss if you're interested. But I thought I'd just put up a list of attributes that I think are central to this notion of anticipatory governance. And just quickly going through them. So first of all, there's an emphasis on foresight and related techniques. So that includes a range of approaches, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with: horizon scanning, for example, trend analysis, and so forth. It includes a clear commitment to the precautionary approach. I realize, of course, that approach can be applied in different ways, but it seemed to me we need a pretty strict kind of precautionary approach. A proactive approach to policy interventions. So rather than waiting for problems to happen and then reacting, actually seeking to be proactive and take action in advance of the problems. And that's going to be particularly relevant for addressing sea level rise. Rather than waiting for flooding to happen, we need to be moving people out of harm's way in advance. And that's going to be a big challenge for humanity over the coming decades and beyond. A systems approach, a holistic view rather than a narrow sort of sectoral view or disaggregated view. We need to recognize the interdependencies between a whole raft of different policy sectors and different things that are going to influence policy outcomes. We need adaptive management, so we need to be agile and willing to change in response to changing circumstances. We need to give particular weight to the goals of resilience and sustainability. We need to support participatory modes of decision making, not least because if we can't take people with us, then we're not going to be able to do what needs to be done. And it seems to me participation, deliberation, and so on provide the means of taking people with you. And then we need to seek to embed long-term interests in day-to-day decision-making, a strategy of embeddedness. And we can talk more about that in due course. Why is it difficult to govern for the future? Well, here's a quote from Lord Martin Rees, former president of the Royal Society in the United Kingdom. He said, "We know we are stewards of a precious pale blue dot in a vast cosmos with a future measured in billions of years. But despite these vastly expanded conceptual horizons, politics and economics are short-term and parochial." And it seems to me he's put his finger on a critical challenge. You know, that there's Earthrise from the moon. We are just a pale blue dot in a vast cosmos, which spreads unbelievably across night sky. And if we don't protect this fragile pale blue dot, then well, we're done for. Why is it so difficult to protect kind of future interests? Well, here's some quotes from a range of politicians, business people, and academics, all really saying something about the short-termism of politics. This is particularly democratic politics, but arguably also autocratic politics. And I think Al Gore's statement there, "The future whispers while the present shouts," is very evocative. I think it highlights a good deal of the kind of the challenge we face. Here's a rather longer list of all the problems that make it difficult for us to govern well for the future. The human condition, the fact that we're dealing with uncertainty, both general and behavioral, a variety of collective action problems that we face, in particular, the challenge of protecting local and global public goods, the big global public goods, obviously including the atmosphere and the oceans and so on. Geopolitical tensions and national self-interest, obviously a critical problem in dealing with many aspects of the ecological challenge facing humanity at the moment. Poor institutional design, both local and global. At the global level, of course, we have weak international institutions that are very much dependent on nation states being willing to act collectively, and often they're not. There's a whole variety of political asymmetries that make it very difficult for governments to make wise decisions for the long run. For example, future generations don't have a vote, current generations do. If current generations don't vote to protect future generations, obviously future generations can't protect their own interests. So that's a very powerful political asymmetry. Another obvious one is that you have very powerful vested interests that have enormous resources to protect their investments. The fossil fuel industry, for example, here in New Zealand, obviously the dairy industry, and they're ranged against typically much weaker dispersed interests that have a much greater difficulty mobilizing resources to protect diverse interests and future interests. Some of our analytical and conceptual frameworks have not helped us. So, for example, as most of you will be aware, the enormous influence and emphasis on GDP as a measure of kind of human progress over the last half century or so has been very unfortunate, because it's a flow measure rather than a stock measure, and you can be expanding your GDP while you're doing enormous social and ecological damage. Eventually, of course, GDP will be brought into line by the damage you're doing, but in the meantime, you might think you're doing quite well. And then there's a whole variety of ethical challenges we face. I mean, competing sort of moral philosophies, but also the problems of incommensurability. How do we compare different systems of value and make decisions when these systems of value are in conflict? So a multiplicity of problems that make governing well for the future very difficult. And I've given quite a lot of attention over the last 7 or 8 years to the problem of short-termism, the presentist bias, as it's often called, and what we might do about it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that now. I just do want to mention creeping problems, because they're a type of policy problem that is actually quite common, but also the kind of problem that's enormously difficult to deal with. So a creeping problem, by sort of definition, is a kind of problem that's out of sight and out of mind. It's a problem that grows slowly and gradually over time, and in a way that often people just don't recognize. But it's a kind of a cumulative problem, and then you reach some sort of tipping point. But by then, unfortunately, an awful lot of damage has been done. So these, creeping problems are ones that typically have initially low public visibility, sort of imperceptible change, limited media interest. You may have a group of scientists who know about the problem and know how serious it is, but they have great difficulty getting the public to take it seriously and politicians to take it seriously until you reach some sort of tipping point. And of course, an awful lot of ecological problems, be it deterioration of fresh water, rising concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, deterioration in soil quality, or the loss of soil, good soils, and so on. All these are kind of creeping problems. And unfortunately, creeping problems tend to be a kind of problem that governments don't deal with very well. So part of the challenge in terms of how do we improve anticipatory governance is how do we make sure that creeping problems or slow threats are given the attention they need. And I've got a list of creeping problems here. Many of them are ecological in nature, but there are many other problems that we face of a creeping nature that are not ecological in nature, increasing inequality of wealth and income, for example, the increasing surveillance society in which we live in, and so on. All right. Obviously, sea level rise is a big creeping problem. I've got a few slides here that highlight that. Loss of glaciers, again, related to climate change, another kind of creeping problem. Okay, so I've dealt with the question, why should we be concerned about the future? And then why is protecting the future difficult? Quick comment on how well are we doing? Short answer, not very well. A quote here from Bill English when he was, I think, Deputy Prime Minister rather than Prime Minister. But he said a hallmark of this government has been to think long term. And you know, when he made that comment 4 years ago, I have to say, I thought, my goodness, Bill, what's your concept of the long run? I thought, if you think your government's thinking long term, then you obviously have a very short-term view of the long run. But nonetheless, I mean, he did think his government was exercising a degree of foresight, and I'm not so sure. I'm not going to go through all this material now. Safe to say, if we think about a range of criteria for assessing how well we are governing for the future in New Zealand and globally, we would have to say, you know, we are not doing very well. And obviously at the heart of not doing very well is the rundown of ecological endowments of various kinds and the huge ecological creeping problems that we face, but many other problems as well. We've not been doing very well in terms of our social outcomes, relatively high poverty rates, very significant inequality in terms of ethnic outcomes, and so on and so on. Some of you are no doubt familiar with the Manawatu River. I thought I'd put that one in because it highlights Nick Smith having a swim in that wonderful river. I think you'd have to pay me a lot of money to swim in that river. Some years ago, my wife and I walked the Tongariro crossing, and we did it just as well as ordinary people. We found that we were among thousands and thousands of people doing it the same day, and it just highlighted to me yet again a kind of a creeping problem. Enormous increase in numbers of tourists, all arriving to sort of see some beautiful countryside or do some specific activities at the same time. Obviously, COVID has somewhat affected the demands on some of our top tourist spots in the country. But if COVID is addressed at least partly over the next few years, we do run the risk, of course, of a return to the kind of scenes we've witnessed in New Zealand in some of our tourist hotspots, and we really must address that challenge head on. Okay, finally, let me just say a few words then about anticipatory governance and how we might enhance anticipatory governance, particularly here in New Zealand. I've also got some slides on the international arena, but I'm going to focus primarily on New Zealand. And to start with, I think it's helpful just to think about kind of the intervention logics or the sort of theories of change that we can bring to bear as we think about how we might better enhance long-term governance or anticipatory governance. And some 6-7 years ago, I did an investigation which led on to a book called Governing for the Future, in which I tried to analyze all kinds of suggestions that people have put forward over the years to enhance long-term governance. And this includes suggestions from constitutional lawyers, from political scientists, from ecologists, from sociologists, anthropologists, people in the natural and physical sciences, and so on. And I outlined a whole list of these suggestions, and then I stood back and said, okay, what is it that what are the theories of change or the intervention logics underpinning these suggestions? Why do people think that if you do X, like extend the term of Parliament, or establish a foresight commission or something. Why do people think this will actually make a difference? What are the intervention logics? And I've identified 6 intervention logics that seem to me to probably capture most of the key, if you like, theories of change. The first is that what's being proposed is going to change the motives of decision makers in some way. And in changing the motives, you're going to get different outcomes. People are going to want to do things differently. So they're going to be more, if you like, ecologically focused or whatever. A second is that what you're proposing to do is going to enhance the capacity for decision makers, be they at central government or local government levels, to make far-sighted decisions. So you're increasing their knowledge base, maybe you're increasing the amount of evidence that they have available to them, you're increasing their understanding of the future risks that the society faces and so on. So you're basically enhancing their capacity for making far-sighted decisions. The third is what you're doing is you're changing the formal constraints within which decisions are made by, for example, introducing certain types of commitment devices. And commitment devices can be both procedural and substantive. The Climate Change Commission here in New Zealand is a classic example of a commitment device. In fact, it contains a series of commitment devices, really. It involves having an independent authoritative institution that it's very difficult for governments to ignore. They can, but there will be political costs in doing so. So that's a kind of constraint. It's set up in a way that requires the institution to produce certain sorts of things. In this case, emission budgets and an emission reduction plan and so forth. And then these things have to be responded to by the governments of the day. There are many commitment devices. The legislation in Wales that I mentioned embodies a whole series of commitment devices. But the basic gist is to try and constrain decision makers so they're more likely to make decisions that are good for the long run. A fourth approach is to say, rather than constraining decision makers, and this is particularly elected decision makers, what we'll do is we'll insulate decision makers from short-term political pressures. And the best way of doing that, of course, is actually to shift decision rights from elected officials to independent experts. And we've done that in New Zealand and many other countries in relation to monetary policy. We've essentially shifted the decision rights on monetary policy from a Minister of Finance to an independent reserve bank. We do it constantly with respect to regulatory bodies. We establish independent regulatory bodies that are responsible for making a variety of decisions, or at least hopefully making a variety of decisions in the long-term interest of the country. So there's this insulation sort of aspect to it. The problem there, of course, is you run the risk of undermining democratic accountability and control. The fifth intervention logic focuses not so much on changing the motives of decision makers or the values of decision makers, but changing the political incentives that they face. And well, that particularly focuses essentially on changing the hearts and minds of voters, since the primary political incentive, certainly in democracy, is going to be votes and voices from the public and so forth. So the challenge then is, well, how do you change the hearts and minds of voters? What are the kinds of levers that you might be able to pull that are going to make a difference there? For example, deliberative institutional arrangements may be a possibility. And then finally, and this is a more sort of instrumentalist kind of approach to things, you might say, well, you've got a problem here because you lack a coordinating capacity. You lack a capacity to coordinate local and central government, for example, or you lack a capacity to coordinate a decision-making and a catchment, or you lack the capacity to coordinate decision-making internationally. And so the solution then is to establish new coordinating mechanisms that overcome that particular problem and enable you to take decisions that otherwise would not be possible. So these intervention logics underpin all the sorts of changes that people have made. There may be other intervention logics. I'd be interested if you can think of some. What can we do in New Zealand that would perhaps enhance anticipatory governance? I mean, there's an awful lot. I've just listed some sort of high-level things here. One of them is to change the parliamentary term, to extend it to 4 years, and probably to make it a fixed term rather than an open-ended term, so that prime ministers can't call an early election except in exceptional circumstances. Second is to embed the future within our democratic institutions and policy processes through extending the kinds of commitment devices we have. So, for example, I've mentioned the Climate Change Commission. Well, one possibility is to have a parallel body for all other critical environmental issues: water, soil, oceans, biodiversity, and so on, to do the same sort of thing that the Climate Change Commission is established to do. Lots of other commitment devices. We can come back to that in discussion maybe. A third is to enhance the political system's capacity for foresight by building foresight capability within the public sector, within the university community, within our parliament, and so on. In other words, to ensure that people are required to focus in on some of the big long-term challenges we face, and to think about what we should do to address them, to apply the techniques of foresight, and there are many such techniques, to thinking about how we might better design our institutions or our policy frameworks and so forth. Fourth approach is to strengthen the institutional voices for the future. Well, we have some of those already. We have a parliamentary commissioner for the environment. We have a children's commissioner who, in a sense, is a voice for the future, as children are our future. But maybe there are a whole raft of other institutional voices that we could either strengthen or establish. Maybe we should think about how do we enhance the voice of science in our policymaking community, within the executive, but also within our parliament. For example, our parliament has hardly any people with significant scientific expertise, whether elected or unelected. Among the officials, the advisors, very few highly trained scientists. Some parliaments around the world, such as the United Kingdom Parliament, have a whole sort of unit dedicated to providing high-level scientific and technical advice to MPs. We have nothing like that. Yes, we have a parliamentary library, but certainly when I was doing some research on this a couple of years ago, I think only one of the staff members in their research unit had a high-level science degree, or advanced science degree. Fifth is we can embed the future more firmly within our policy frameworks and our policy tools. A variety of ways of doing that, amongst other things, and I was talking to Jack about this before this session. We need to think about how we better integrate environmental or ecological concerns into our budgetary processes, both on the expenditure side and on the revenue side. How do we green, in other words, our budgetary institutions and make them more fit for purpose in terms of protecting long-term interests? And finally, how do we nurture a political culture that facilitates durable political bargains on important intergenerational issues, and that is alert to creeping problems? And can I say just a few quick comments then, and then maybe just throw it open for discussion, because I've spoken probably long enough. My reading of the current situation internationally is that the countries which seem to be exercising the best, if you like, long-term governance are also those societies which are more egalitarian in their income distribution. And the countries which are struggling most are the countries which have significant income and wealth inequality. Now, that proposition can be contested, but it seems to me there is a logic to why a more egalitarian society is more likely to be able to address big long-term problems. One reason will be because they're likely to be less politically polarized. Societies which are highly unequal are likely to be more polarized than societies which are relatively equal. And I think part of the problem in the United States and in other parts of Europe, in parts of Europe and arguably in other parts of the world, which we've witnessed in the last 10, 20 years with growing political polarization, the rise of right-wing populism and so on, is, I think, directly the result of increased income and wealth inequality. Not only that, but I think that's been an important dimension. If I'm right, then if we're going to have a political culture that facilitates durable political bargains on some of the really big intergenerational challenges we face, it seems to me we're going to have to try and address income and wealth inequality. And that's really hard. And I don't pretend there's any easy solutions to that. It's very easy for a society to increase its wealth and income inequality. You simply cut taxes on rich people. You do other things that make the tax system less egalitarian, less progressive, and so on. Reversing that is much, much harder, because it's much harder to take away from wealthy, influential people than it is to give things to them. And so I think if we're going to tackle wealth and income inequality, it's going to be really tough. I note, incidentally, that the OECD has proposed that governments should increase their reliance on inheritance taxes over the coming years in order to address the fiscal challenges that COVID has generated. We should note here in New Zealand, of course, we don't have any inheritance taxes. In fact, we have a tax regime which is perhaps as favorable to the wealthy as almost any country on the planet. We don't have estate duties, we don't have inheritance taxes, we don't have comprehensive capital gains tax, and so on. But we've also witnessed the challenge of governments actually seeking to make policy changes in this space. So Jack, the rest of these slides sort of go through some of the details of how we might enhance commitment devices or develop new commitment devices, and so on, how we might improve foresight, how we might strengthen voices for the future, and how we might enhance our analytical frameworks, and so on. I'm happy to come back to these in questions, but then just to sort of sum up, we face some very, very big challenges. We need to address them as best we can, because if we don't, the implications for future generations are truly horrendous. Unfortunately, there are very powerful reasons why governments find it hard to protect future interests. But there are things we can do that would make a difference. And we need to, in my view, kind of use our imaginations and use our energy and intellectual endeavor to use all the tools that we can possibly find that will enhance our long-term governance or anticipatory governance. We've made some progress in New Zealand, I think, in a number of respects in recent times, but there's a huge amount more that needs to be done. All right, Jack, I hope that's just a useful, quick overview, and I'm very happy to hear what other people have to say and respond to questions where I can. Thank you.
That's great, Jonathan. Thank you very much. It's a very, very helpful overview. And what I know that some people have already put some questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen. And if anyone has additional questions, if they would please type them in there so everyone can see them, and we'll try to go through them. And as you're doing that, there's a couple of questions that occurred to me that I'd like to start out with. One has to do with the well-being approach that Treasury has implemented a while back. I mean, it seems to me that that has potential to contribute to this process of anticipatory governance. And I'd be very interested in your perspective on what its strengths and weaknesses are, and particularly what can be done to strengthen it at this point, in terms of what's already been accomplished, and what can be done next to move it along.
Okay, so Jack, that's a huge question. Let me just make some very quick comments and see what other people might think about this as well. So the first thing is that the Treasury began about 12 years ago to develop what it called its living standards framework, which is being transmuted now into what is called the well-being framework, partly as a result of the change of government 3.5 years ago. The living standards framework basically involved a recognition that we needed to focus not only on on flows like GDP, but also on stocks. And so the living standards framework had 4 primary stocks or capitals: natural capital, social capital, human capital, and kind of everything else, manufactured and financial capital. And said, you know, if we're to govern well, both now and for the future, we need to manage our capital stocks well. And we're not doing particularly well, obviously, in respect of some of those capital stocks, most notably our natural capital. It also had 5 goals, which included things like managing risk, sustainability, social cohesion, which became equity, thinking about sort of economic growth and productivity, and there was one other, forgive me, I can't remember now. What happened around the time of the change of government is that the language changed from the living standards to well-being. I'll come back to well-being briefly in a minute, but also the Treasury took away the 5 goals, the Pentagon, and kind of left its analytical framework devoid, really, of those 5 goals. Now, the Treasury would probably say, well, we've replaced it with well-being and a whole set of well-being domains, 12 domains, and then arguably a set of, you know, targets and indicators in relation to those domains. 2 or 3 very quick comments here on that well-being framework. First of all, I'm an advocate of having a holistic approach to the goals of governments, and to ensure that we think about performance in a very broad way, integrated way, rather than having a very narrow fixation with one particular or just several indicators like GDP or inflation or whatever. So philosophically, I'm well disposed to the well-being framework. Having said that, a focus on well-being is problematic in a number of respects, Jack. The first is it doesn't tell you whose well-being is most important. It doesn't tell you how to balance current and future generations' well-being. It doesn't really tell you what kind of well-being is most important. Is it you know, spiritual well-being, economic well-being, cultural well-being, social well-being, ecological well-being, or whatever. It doesn't tell us either how we balance the needs of nature, if you like, with the needs of humanity, and so on. So it leaves open a whole lot of really difficult and critical philosophical stuff. And the final comment I'd make is that while I'm in favor of a well-being approach relative to what we've had, I think it's fair to say that the well-being approach fits more within a, if you like, a utilitarian philosophical framework than, say, a rights-based philosophical framework. And I must confess, I'm more inclined to a rights-based philosophical framework. So, you know, the big philosophical debates over the last few hundred years have been between those who say, you know, we should maximize utility. Now it's maximize well-being. And those who say, actually, there's a whole lot of really critical things which we can call rights that matter: civil rights, political rights, social rights, economic rights, the rights of nature, and so on. And rights trump utility, at least often. And from a philosophical point of view, and this, I think, reflects, to be honest, my theological underpinnings as a Christian, I'm much more inclined to focus on rights than I am on utility. And so if it comes to the crunch, I would rather we had a rights-based approach. Let's go back to the, you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, rather than a well-being approach. But I'd settle for a well-being approach ahead of what we've had any day.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction, the rights versus the utilitarian approach. Is there any consideration of framing the well-being issues in a rights perspective? I mean, are they
Well,
really incompatible?
they're not necessarily incompatible, Jack, because one of the domains of well-being can be, and is indeed, your sort of civil rights, civil and political rights. So, one of the ways of saying of testing kind of the degree or level or amount of well-being that people have is how extensive are their civil and political rights, and how readily can they enjoy those rights. So it's not necessarily, but I think rights matter whether or not they generate well-being. So if we think about the right to vote, that's absolutely critically important, and it's based on a view that every individual beyond a certain age is of equal value, and they feel like their voice should have equal weight in the political domain. Now, whether or not that enhances well-being, frankly, at one level, I couldn't care less. It's not designed to achieve well-being. It's designed to recognize that human beings are of equal value and should have an equal right to participate in their society.
Yeah, it occurs to me that
it's a different kind of worldview, Jack.
Mm-hmm. But it occurs to me that the comment you made about the well-being approach, some of the inadequacies, the way the Treasury has currently conceptualized it, in terms of, what kind of well-being.
And whose well-being?
That's one of the things that bothered me about it, is that it was a very big tent and not very well defined at all. There was no real theory of what well-being was. And anyway, it's interesting.
Well, Jack, I mean, there's a huge philosophical debate about the nature of well-being.
Sure,
I mean, there's books written about this. The OECD, I think, has done a creditable job in trying to identify, what it calls domains of well-being, and we've basically taken the OECD perspective on this and added another domain, which is essentially cultural well-being. And I think what the OECD has done is defensible and plausible and creditable, but it doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't tell you whether we should focus on the well-being of the poor or the well-being of the rich. It doesn't tell you whether we should focus on the well-being of people today or people in 100 years' time. To address that, we need other criteria or principles, ethical judgments.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway,
but
thank
look,
you.
Others may have views on
Thank you
this.
for introducing that fascinating juxtaposition of different perspectives. It's an important one that I hadn't considered, and it's always useful to have your mind expanded like that. Okay, well, I turn to some of the questions in the chat. One of the questions from Sally is, would you consider citizens' assembly as a possible commitment device? Can you see that helping to insulate politicians and decision makers by getting broad public consensus through something like a citizens' assembly?
Yes, so the first thing I need to say is that I have read some of the literature on deliberative democracies, deliberative democracy, and there's a rich literature there now, and there have been a variety of experiments around the world using different sorts of deliberative mechanisms, of which citizens assemblies and citizens juries and so on are among the most obvious manifestations. In general terms, I'm very much in favor of deliberative institutions. There is, I think, reasonably robust social science evidence that when you bring people together to deliberate about a particular problem, first of all, in the main, the people involved engage with that issue thoughtfully. They typically are able to understand the full range of considerations that need to be brought to bear, and they are, in a deliberative context, particularly if it's well managed, more likely there'll be a tendency to shift their position, or an openness to shift their position, and also to think about what might be, if you like, in the public interest rather than just private interest, and what might be for the long-term interest of the community and not just the short-term interest of the community. So, you know, I can provide people with some articles on this if people are interested in over the coming days. But I think there's at least some reasonably robust evidence that deliberative mechanisms enhance the quality of analysis and extend the time horizons of people, and extend the kind of openness to thinking about problems in a different way. So anything we can do that will enhance deliberative approaches to problem solving, I think we should try and adopt. Having said all that, you know, there are obvious limits to the numbers of, if you like, you know, citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries that we can run at any one time, the number of issues that can be put to such bodies. So, you know, there are some practical limits, particularly in a large democratic polity, you know, like New Zealand, or let alone much bigger ones. So I think that's an issue, Jack, that, you know, we have to recognize there are times and seasons for using different sorts of deliberative mechanisms, but in the end, still lots of decisions are going to have to be taken by our representative institutions, our parliaments. And while parliaments are supposed to be deliberative, you know, unfortunately, some of the time they spend in non-deliberative shouting matches. So one of the questions then is, you know, how might you reform your parliamentary institutions in ways that enhance the quality of long-term decision making? And well, we can come to that if people are interested.
Yeah. Are there any particular deliberative democracy approaches or mechanisms other than citizens' assembly that you think are particularly helpful or worthwhile?
So Jack, there's a whole lot of what are called sort of mini publics that people have proposed, and some of these will be online sort of mini publics. Others will be face-to-face. They have different structures in terms of the numbers of people who might be involved, and the range of sorts of issues and questions that people are required to address. I mean, there's quite a substantive literature on this now, Jack.
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that. I was just curious.
Some very useful summary articles. I'm just trying to remember the name of, yes, John Dryzik, an Australian political scientist, political philosopher, is perhaps one of the best known writers in this field. And if people are interested, he's written both books and a whole series of articles on deliberative institutions of different kinds. Graham Smith in the United Kingdom, likewise. In fact, I think he's recently finished a book on deliberative institutions. I have to be honest, Jack, it's not my primary area of research, so I need to be careful what I say here.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on to a question from Rosalind about educating politicians about, you know, the long-term issues, and, you know, similar to the sort of things that you've been discussing this evening. I know you've discussed this option of educating politicians, as, you know, when there's a new term of parliament and so on. Could you speak to that? Is that happening anywhere? Is that do you see that as a useful step?
Yes. So various things that I think probably relevant to comment on. The first is, just for the benefit of those who aren't aware, I was asked by the Clerk of the House, David Wilson, about 3 years ago, if I would help some of his staff prepare a report for the Standing Orders Committee of the House on the question about how we might enhance the ways in which Parliament holds governments to account for the quality of their long-term governance. And over the period of mid-2018 to mid-2019, I worked with a team of people in the Office of the Clerk and a few colleagues in the university to produce quite a substantial report on this whole question about how do we get Parliament to exercise its proper role of holding the executive to account, but not just sort of generally, but specifically for the quality of its long-term governance. And so that report is available on the parliamentary website. It's also on the website of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies, which published the report. And it had a whole series of proposals for parliamentary reform, everything from the question about how we organize the select committee system to how we run select committees, how we resource them with analytical advice, scientific advice, and so forth, through to questions about some new commitment devices that we could institute, for example, a requirement for the Prime Minister to give an outline of the government's future-focused goals at the beginning of every Parliament, through to a range of other mechanisms. We also outlined sort of broader constitutional reforms, including extending the term of Parliament, introducing a fixed term Parliament, and so forth. So there's that side of it. Then in terms of educating MPs, bear in mind, most people who get elected to Parliament come with, a reasonable amount of education and experience and expertise of various kinds. But many of them don't know much about lawmaking and about how policy gets made within the public sector and so forth. So a couple of years ago, Parliament asked Victoria University if we could assist in some way in running programs for politicians. And over the last couple of years, we've been running courses for MPs on policy analysis, on constitutional issues of various kinds, on economic policy making, and so on. And we've also done some short courses on that kind of thing. I have to be honest, Jack, I'm not sure just how helpful that material has been, but the MPs who've been involved in those programs can speak for themselves and say whether they found it useful. I've certainly enjoyed the engagement that I've had with MPs through that particular process.
How many actually
I'd have to say,
participate?
can I just add two or three other very quick points? The first is that our Parliament is very small by international standards, 120 MPs. Most parliaments, even for countries of our size, are significantly bigger. Norway, about 179, I think. Denmark, 200 MPs. Sweden, which of course is somewhat larger population, has 350 MPs. Ireland has a lower house, I think 166, but it also has a Senate of about 60, so well over 200 politicians. We have a small house, so that is limiting in terms of the range of expertise and backgrounds and so on. And I think we should have a larger Parliament, but unfortunately, most people think we've got too many politicians. The second quick comment is, I really do think we need to have better resourcing of Parliament by means of independent analysis for MPs, better scientific and technical expertise being made available to politicians. We don't, for example, at the moment have a chief science advisor to Parliament? I think we should. So there's a range of things that go simply beyond, if you like, quite educating MPs, but to the resources that MPs have available to them to help them do their job.
Okay, thanks. And the next question from Sally here is about extending the election cycle and what impact that might have. I know you've addressed this in some of your writing.
Yes, so I'm an advocate of a 4-year parliamentary term, and I have been for a very long time. If we move to a 4-year term, it seems to me we should have a fixed or semi-fixed term, so that prime ministers can't call snap elections willy-nilly, because if they can, then potentially extending the parliamentary term won't in fact achieve its objective. There are various ways you can fix a parliamentary term. It can be an absolute fix, so that you have an election every 4 years on a particular date, for example, as in the presidential elections in the United States, as in Norway. Or you can have a semi-fixed parliamentary term, which enables you to call an early election, but only under very certain under specified circumstances. In Sweden, they've devised a mechanism which I think is rather good, which is that yes, you can call an early election, but if you do, you still have to have the election you would otherwise have had. So what that basically means is, yes, if you get to a point where you've got complete stalemate because of the way the numbers have fallen in Parliament and government simply can't govern, you can call an early election to deal with that stalemate, but you then have to take on board the wrath of voters in going to the polls again, possibly only 8 months later. So that's a very, very powerful incentive for politicians to try and sort themselves out and work together for the common good. And I think something like that might be a sensible solution. It means you can, if you really do have a constitutional crisis, call an early election, but boy, you have to have very powerful reasons for doing it, because you're going to have another election not long afterwards.
Right.
The only other comment I'd make, Jack, is that while I'm in favor of a longer term, I frankly don't think it's going to make a huge difference to the quality of governance or to the quality of anticipatory governance. On the margins, it's going to help governments deal with some very big problems, which at the moment they have only limited time to address. So, for example, I'm involved, as I mentioned, in the Ministry for the Environment at the moment, working on resource management reform. Is incredibly complicated. It would be wonderful to have an extra year in which you can then consult more fully with citizens, do more detailed analysis, and have a bit more time to kind of work through the big problems that need to be addressed. A 3-year parliamentary term means, essentially everything has to be done quite fast, and when things are done fast, there's always a greater chance that you'll make some bad decisions or make a mess of things. So, but having said that, we have to reckon on the fact that countries like New Zealand and Australia, which have short parliamentary terms, much shorter than the majority of countries which have democratic institutions, nonetheless, broadly speaking, Australia and New Zealand are relatively well governed. And we're not likely to be vastly better governed if we had a 4-year term.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on to Mark's question about barriers. You mentioned a whole range of barriers to anticipatory governance, and Mark's question is about the relationship between those barriers and whether there are some key ones or trigger ones that, if they're removed or mitigated in some way, that might facilitate the elimination of other barriers.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I suppose another way of putting it would be, of the various causes of the problems we have in terms of trying to ensure good long-term governance, which are the really critical ones? Is it the human condition, our tendency to be myopic and self-interested and so on? Is it political economy problems, the power of vested interests? Is it the problem that we have these powerful political asymmetries operating within a democracy? I wish I knew. I mean, I tend to be of the view, Jack, that most big problems are multi-causal and tend to be relatively wicked in the sense that they're not amenable to any simple solution, and that every solution you come up with probably is going to create some new problems, unfortunately. So if someone said, is the fundamental problem here constitutional? I'd say no. Is the fundamental problem institutional? I'd say no. Is the fundamental problem the human condition? Well, no. It's really a whole combination of things, and they're all interconnected.
And I suspect that their relationship in terms of being triggers or facilitating others varies from issue to issue as well.
Yes, indeed, and from country to country and from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
So there will be times and seasons, and obviously there are times when you have a crisis that enables you to do things that you can't otherwise do. I mean, just to think, in New Zealand, in the last 16 months, we've witnessed things that probably most of us would never have envisaged. I mean, if someone had said to me 18 months ago that we would close the borders for, well, an indefinite period, I'd have said, you're mad. But we've done that. We don't know when the borders are going to open again. But there were good reasons for doing what the government did. But boy, I mean, quite remarkable. Which also does highlight, Jack, doesn't it? That in a crisis, if you have a sufficiently sort of emergency situation, you are able to do things that otherwise are really, really extremely difficult to do. Years ago, look, I'd be interested in what other people think, so I'll make this comment and then I should shut up. But in 2006, in March 2006, I helped run a conference at Zapapa on climate change, and we had a whole raft of distinguished international speakers, scientists, business people, and so on. One of the speakers was Lord Ron Oxburgh, who was a distinguished geologist, had been the head of Imperial College London, and also had been chair of the big company called Shell, the big energy company, oil company. And he said in the course of his keynote address at the Soundings Theatre at the end of March 2006, that he thought climate change was such a serious issue that we should put the global economy on a war footing to deal with it. This is 15 years ago. He said we should put the global economy on a war footing to deal with the seriousness of the problem. I mean, I think he's right. but two things to note. The first was those remarks were never reported. I was amazed. There were journalists in the audience. Nobody reported this. And the second, of course, nobody's done it. And even now, 2021, with all the knowledge we have of what the risks are if we fail to decarbonize the global economy very fast. Despite that, most democracies are struggling to really implement the kinds of policies needed to make a difference. And it's all very well, we can say, thank goodness, Trump has been replaced by Biden, and that Biden is now committed to very large emission reductions by 2030. We still have to ask, well, how is he going to achieve it? It's all very well having a target, really be able to get the sort of policy measures needed to achieve that target through Congress. Well, there's a very significant risk he won't. And we've got a Republican Party, the majority of whom seem to still doubt that we've got a problem. I mean, it's incredible. Anyway,
let's
I'd
move
be
on
interested to know what others have to say, Jack.
Well, there's still a lot of questions here, unless anyone has a burning comment they would like to make. Perhaps you could use the reaction and use the clap signal to indicate you would like to make a comment. Give you an opportunity to do that, or I'll continue going through the questions. Now we've got more questions coming.
Well, we can keep going, Jack.
Yeah, I'm just going back to the questions. There was, that's right, one from Deirdre about systems approaches being important and suggesting that the Climate Commission should be supplemented by other environmental ones. Yet a systems requires integration of the, a futures commission to sort of put it all together, because these things are ultimately related.
So, Jack, I think one of the big problems we've got in terms of dealing with our ecological problems in New Zealand is that clearly the sorts of policy changes that are needed, whether it's with respect to water or biodiversity, climate, and so on, they require hard decisions in the sense that politicians will risk losing votes and also upsetting very powerful interests that will campaign vigorously against them. And so there's significant political risks in making the sorts of decisions that really ought to be made in the interests of long-term ecological sustainability. And the question then becomes, how do we reduce those risks? What are the sorts of things we can do that will make it easier for politicians to make the decisions that they ought to make in the long-term public interest, in the interest of long-term sustainability? I don't think there's any simple answer to the question, but it's one that deserves, a lot of careful thought. One way is having things like the Climate Commission that provide expert authoritative advice that is very hard to reject. We haven't had that kind of institution before in the environmental space, with the possible exception of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. But the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is a relatively small institution, and it's one person rather than a commission. It hasn't kind of had the mandate that the Climate Change Commission has in specific statutory terms.
Yeah, but the point of my question was solving the climate issue is one thing, but there are a lot of other environmental problems to solve. And, Molly asked a question, for instance, of one of the commissioners on one of the webinars, where she said, and what do you predict the energy use will be? Will that just keep going up until 2050? And he said, yes. And GDP? And he said, yes. Or it'll be 72% instead of 73%. This is really critical. I mean, because we're only dealing with one issue, and they're all interrelated. The material throughput and the energy use and the complexity of a society is really just as important.
Yes, so I totally understand your concern here, Deirdre. There's multiple concerns, but one of them is that our ecological problems are all interconnected, and we can't solve one without endeavoring to solve the others. If we don't address biodiversity problems, well, there's going to be a whole set of other issues and what have you. Anyway, the question from an institutional design point of view is, should we seek to have some overarching cross-domain, system-wide institution,
Mhm.
or should we have a series of domain-specific institutions?
In which
Like the
case you have
Climate
to
Commission.
integrate them and you have to get them communicating.
Yes, but yes, but can I just finish here? So we now have a Climate Commission. I, for one, would be very reluctant to do anything that might damage that commission in the near term, because it's just getting underway. The UK model seems to have worked tolerably well, relative at least to what might have been the case if we hadn't had a climate change committee in the UK. And I'd be very reluctant to kind of change the commission, the Climate Change Commission, in the near term. So if that's the case, you then have to say, okay, what do we do for the other domains? Well, we could have domain-specific institutions, one for, you know, biodiversity, one for water, one for coast, one for oceans, whatever. I don't think that would be very sensible, Deirdre. So
No.
my view is it would be preferable to have some overarching body that speaks for the whole sort of environmental domain, the whole lot, with the exception of arguably of some specific aspects of climate that are clearly covered by the Climate Change Commission. And then to try and ensure that the Commission, the Climate Change Commission, and this other body obviously have a proper dialogue together about the matters that are interdependent. But in all this, we face, you know, some really challenging political issues. There's first of all the question: would our current Parliament support some new commission, an independent commission that covers everything other than climate? Secondly, there's considerable you know, demand within the Maori community for having a Tamana o Te Taio commission that would be predominantly a Maori body, or a body representing Maori interests, rights and interests. And then you have to say, well, where would that fit? Would you tack it on to some sort of broad environmental council, or would it stand separately? And what would its powers and functions be? So that's another issue. And then even if you did establish a body comparable to the Climate Commission kind of for everything else, if I can put it that way, plainly it would have to have sub-panels for specific issues, because, you know, freshwater issues are distinct and require specific expertise relative to soil, relative to biodiversity, and so on. And then there's the problem, well, what might the implications of that be for, you know, for the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, another institution which I, for one, would be reluctant to damage. So you know, there's no simple institutional fix here, it seems to me.
Yeah, we lost our Futures Commission, and their stuff isn't even online.
Yes, and I'm not sure, Deirdre, that simply a Futures Commission would help very much. I'm not against a Futures Commission, and I like very much the Welsh model of having a commissioner who speaks for future generations. But bear in mind, they don't have a parliamentary commissioner for the environment. And in some ways, you know, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is the strongest, if you like, voice for the future that we have. And not surprisingly, much of the focus of the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations is about environmental issues, not least climate change and biodiversity.
Thank you.
Jonathan, one of the things that strikes me is, you know, the broad range of policy changes that are needed to really boost the whole anticipatory governance approach. You know, it's a very complex process, and there's many components that are either weak or totally missing. And it's obviously going to be a long-term process. But also in passing, you mentioned powerful vested interests. To what extent is that a relevant barrier in terms of interfering with the sort of policy suites that seem obvious to implement? But, you know, we don't have long enough parliamentary terms. We don't have enough parliamentarians to serve on parliamentary committees for the future or whatever. But how much are vested interests interfering with some of these progressive policies in your
Big
view?
time.
I think Molly wants to have a comment on that.
No, I just said it matters big time.
Yes, absolutely, Molly. Well, you may have been watching events in Australia where two former prime ministers joined forces in highlighting the enormously damaging role of the Murdoch press in Australia and its huge impact on Australian, on the quality of Australian democracy.
Yes.
And much the same could be said about the impact of the Murdoch press in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Here you have, a mega rich individual or family that has deliberately chosen to seek to exercise an enormous influence on democratic politics in a series of Western democracies, and has been relatively successful. And I think has done huge damage to the integrity of democracy, unfortunately.
Yeah. What's your experience in terms of the New Zealand situation?
Well, thankfully, Murdoch hasn't been so sort of influential on this side of the Tasman, and we haven't had a Fox News.
But surely there are powerful political or powerful vested interests.
Yes, absolutely.
To what extent are they interfering with the New Zealand?
Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious, Jack, that on some of the issues that we've been talking about this evening, if it's climate, there's no question that the fossil fuel industry in New Zealand and the dairy industry in New Zealand has exercised enormous influence over the policy direction of governments for the last 30 years or so. No question at all. And they're continuing to try to do so, obviously. There's been a very strong, strident campaign against the Climate Change Commission from powerful vested interests. And we'll have to see what impact that has. And then, in other policy domains, you think about, seeds and biodiversity. Monsanto and is it Bayer and other big multinational corporations obviously exercise huge influence in those sorts of policy domains. So there's absolutely no question that the business interests of various kinds, and not just business interests, but typically business interests, exercise a disproportionate influence on many important issues of public policy. And part of the challenge in climate change, obviously, has been to try and shift the fulcrum of the business community in a way that enough influential business people see it as in their interests commercially to act to address climate change. And we do seem finally to be getting close to that tipping point, if we haven't already crossed the tipping point, where enough business interests, be they banking, insurance, renewable energy, clean energy, whatever, companies now see themselves as, as having a powerful interest in decarbonization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add?
Go ahead, Molly.
The business interests in this country have been able to narrow the scope of the Climate Change Commission's work so that it cannot achieve what we really want. That is, the CCC believes that we need to grow by 72% rather than 73%. Essentially, they want the original growth path. And I believe that it is vested interests are driving this, narrowing the scope of what the CCC can consider.
Oh, interesting.
We're approaching closing time, and I have to apologize to the folks who have put questions up that we've not been able to get to. But I'd like to put one last question to you, Jonathan. we have a federal or a national budget coming up. What are the few things that you would like to see in it that you feel would make the most contribution to anticipatory governance?
Oh, well, Jack, you and I were talking about this earlier. I think we need to move to a very specific kind of green budgetary approach in which, amongst other things, the government is very transparent in its budget about what it is doing that will impact on the environment, either positively or negatively. So you actually have a positive list and a negative list, if you like. France has done this, incidentally, in its recent budgets. It's identified what areas of spending will likely improve the environment, what areas of spending will actually impact negatively on environmental outcomes, and what areas of spending probably will be relatively neutral. And one can do the same for revenue. You know, what areas of revenue that we're collecting are likely to help improve environmental outcomes, maybe because they're environmental taxes. What areas might actually impact negatively on environmental outcomes for one reason or another, and what areas of revenue might be relatively neutral. So greater transparency and specificity in the budget process in terms of environmental outcomes would be at least one step in the right direction among many other possible steps. And if I could just make one final comment, Jack, and then I need to get to bed. But well, thank you for those who've listened in, and I'm sorry perhaps we haven't had more of a dialogue, more deliberation. I've done most of the talking, and I'm sorry, but it would be really good to have a further discussion sometime about the whole issue of economic growth and how we how we can understand the nature of economic growth, because this is a huge topic and it's an important one. But if I can make a very simple distinction, we do need to distinguish between growth in the size of things like buildings or roads, or stocks of capital, whatever, and growth in the value of the goods and services we exchange. And potentially, if we were being absolutely faithful in protecting ecological goals and acting completely consistently with what is needed for long-term ecological sustainability, it is at least conceivable that we could improve or increase the value of the goods and services exchanged among us, potentially forever, on the basis that the only limit, assuming we are doing everything right in terms of ecological sustainability, the only limit to enhancing the value of the goods and services we exchange in such a world would be our human imagination.
Well, Jonathan, I think you've just invited yourself to another webinar. We would love to have that discussion with you. And first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for this one. It's been very informative and certainly has introduced new ideas and concepts to me, and I hope to others as well. While it's still left a lot of questions, and you've given us I think a very helpful overview of some of the challenges that we face and that we can face more realistically in terms of trying to move this whole thing forward. So again, thank you for all of you who have attended, and to remind you that Jonathan's slides will be on the OCD website to make them available, as well as the YouTube link if you would like to come back to the recording or tell others about it and direct them to it. So we will Our next webinar will be in a month. I can't recall the date at the moment, but Max Rashbrook, sorry, will
Rashbrook.
be talking to us about taxation and inequality issues. And again, the notice will be on our declaration website. So thanks to all who participated, and especially to Jonathan.
Okay.
And
Thank you. Thanks, Jack.
very many good wishes.
All right. Good night, everyone. Okay.
Good night, all.
All the
Thank
best.
you.
Cheers. Right. Bye.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jack.